In the eastern part of California, tucked against the towering wall of the Sierra Nevada, there is a broad, quiet valley that most people have never heard of, and yet it is one of the most closely watched pieces of ground in all of North America. It looks, from the surface, like an ordinary and beautiful landscape of high country, ringed by snow-capped mountains, dotted with steaming hot springs. Home to a popular resort town and the many skiers and hikers who come each year for the scenery. But beneath that peaceful surface lies something far more formidable. This valley is not really a valley in the ordinary sense at all. It is a caldera, an enormous crater left behind by one of the most colossal volcanic eruptions in the history of the continent, and beneath it, miles down, there remains a body of molten and partly molten rock, the lingering heart of the ancient volcano. It is called Long Valley, and every so often it stirs. The ground rises, the earth trembles, and the scientists who keep their vigil over it take careful note. And once again, in the latest chapter of its restless history, Long Valley has risen. And its rising raises an uncomfortable question about whether the region on and below it is truly ready for whatever the caldera might someday do. This is the story of that restless ground, of what its rising means and what it does not. To understand why Long Valley commands such attention, you have to understand what it is and how it came to be. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, this place was the site of a volcanic eruption of almost unimaginable scale, an event so vast that it dwarfs anything in recorded human history. The eruption blasted out an enormous volume of material, so much that the ground above the emptied magma chamber collapsed downward, forming the great oval depression that is the caldera, a crater many miles across. It was one of those rare cataclysmic eruptions that reshaped the landscape on a continental scale, spreading ash across vast distances and leaving behind a scar in the earth so large it can be seen from space. That eruption was long ago, and the volcano has not done anything remotely like it since. But the plumbing that fed it, the deep reservoir of hot rock, has never entirely gone away. Beneath Long Valley, that reservoir still exists, still hot, still capable in principle of feeding future activity. And it is the presence of that reservoir that makes the caldera a place scientists cannot afford to ignore. The reason Long Valley is in the news from time to time is that it is an active, restless caldera, one that periodically shows signs of unrest. Over the decades, the floor of the caldera has risen measurably, swelling upward as pressure builds beneath it, and this uplift is often accompanied by swarms of earthquakes, clusters of small tremors that rattle the region as the ground adjusts to the movement below. These episodes of unrest come and go. There have been periods when the caldera rose and shook with notable vigor, prompting concern and intense scientific scrutiny, followed by quieter stretches when the activity subsided. The most recent rising is the latest chapter in this long pattern of restlessness, the caldera once again reminding everyone that it is not dead, but merely sleeping, and that its sleep is a fitful one. When the ground rises again, it is a signal that the deep forces beneath Long Valley are once more in motion, and that the vigilant monitoring of the caldera is as necessary as ever. Now, here is where it is essential to be careful and clear, because the subject of a restless caldera lends itself all too easily to alarm, and the reality demands a more measured understanding. The rising of the ground at Long Valley and the earthquake swarms that often accompany it do not mean that an eruption is imminent. This is a point that the scientists who study the caldera have made consistently and emphatically. Calderas like Long Valley can rise and shake many times over, across decades and centuries, without erupting at all. The unrest is a normal feature of a living caldera, the expression of magma and hot fluids shifting and pressurizing far below. And the overwhelming majority of such episodes end without any eruption whatsoever. The uplift is watched closely, not because it signals impending catastrophe, but because monitoring is the prudent and responsible thing to do when you live above a system capable, in principle, of a large eruption. To watch is wise. To panic is unwarranted. The rising of Long Valley is a reason for attention, not for fear. Indeed, recent scientific work on Long Valley has offered a genuinely reassuring interpretation of the unrest. Studies probing the deep structure of the caldera have suggested that much of the restlessness may actually reflect the slow cooling and solidifying of the magma reservoir over time. The system gradually releasing gases and fluids as it settles down rather than building toward an eruption. In this view, the rising and shaking is the caldera exhaling, the aftermath of an ancient volcanic system winding down over immense spans of time, not gearing up for a new outburst. If this understanding is correct, then the unrest at Long Valley, unsettling as it may seem, is better read as the long, slow death of a volcano than as the prelude to its reawakening. This does not mean an eruption is impossible, for the deep reservoir still holds molten rock and the future can never be known with certainty, but it does place the recent rising in a far less frightening light than the raw fact of a swelling, shaking caldera might suggest. Still, the title raises a pointed and fair question about preparedness, about whether the region below and around the caldera is truly ready for the worst, however unlikely that worst may be. And this is a legitimate matter for reflection, because the responsible approach to any low probability but high consequence hazard is to be prepared even for the outcomes you do not expect. It is worth acknowledging honestly that planning for a caldera eruption is an extraordinarily difficult undertaking, far more so than planning for many other natural hazards. A large volcanic eruption is not like a wildfire or a flood, events that communities face regularly and have well-developed plans to address. It is a rare, enormous, and complex event. And the very rarity that makes it so hard to imagine also makes it hard to plan for in concrete terms. How do you draw up an evacuation plan for an event that may not happen for thousands of years, that could take many forms, and whose scale could range from a modest local eruption to something far larger? The truth is that emergency planning for volcanic hazards is a genuine challenge everywhere that active volcanoes and calderas exist near populated areas, and it is a challenge that authorities grapple with in different ways and with varying degrees of readiness. In the case of Long Valley, the region is relatively sparsely populated compared to the great cities of California, with the resort town and scattered communities rather than dense urban sprawl sitting on the caldera, and this shapes the nature of the planning problem. The scientific monitoring of the caldera is in fact extensive and sophisticated, among the most thorough of any volcanic system in the country, precisely so that any real movement toward an eruption would be detected well in advance. The key point that scientists emphasize is that a large eruption would almost certainly not come without warning. The kind of unrest that precedes a genuine eruption, the escalating earthquakes, the accelerating ground deformation, the changes in the gases and the heat, would build over time and would be detected by the monitoring network, giving authorities and residents time to respond. The vigilance of the monitoring is itself a form of preparedness, the early warning system that would sound the alarm if the caldera ever truly began to stir toward an eruption. That said, monitoring is not the same as a fully developed evacuation plan, and the honest observation that formal, detailed evacuation planning for a caldera eruption is often limited or underdeveloped is a fair one. Applicable not just to Long Valley, but to many volcanic regions. The gap between scientific monitoring, which is excellent, and public emergency planning, which is harder and less complete, is a real feature of how societies handle these rare and daunting hazards. It reflects the genuine difficulty of planning for something so rare and so large. The competition for attention and resources among the many more frequent hazards a place like California faces, and the psychological challenge of preparing seriously for an event that seems almost impossibly remote. This is not a unique failing of any one place, but a widespread reality, and pointing it out is not cause for alarm, but an invitation to think about how we prepare for the rare catastrophes that lie at the edge of our imagination. It is worth understanding, too, just how remarkable the monitoring of Long Valley actually is, because it is the real reason that the region can live above the caldera with confidence rather than dread. The caldera is laced with an array of instruments that watch it continuously, day and night, year after year. There are seismometers that detect the faintest tremors deep below, capable of registering earthquakes far too small for any person to feel, and of pinpointing exactly where beneath the caldera they occur. There are instruments that measure the swelling and settling of the ground with extraordinary precision, tracking the rise and fall of the caldera floor to within tiny fractions of an inch. There are measurements of the gases that seep up from below, of the temperature of the hot springs, of the subtle changes that would accompany any movement of magma toward the surface. All of this data flows continuously to the scientists who study the caldera, giving them a detailed, real-time picture of what is happening in the depths. This is not a system that could be caught by surprise. A caldera moving toward a genuine eruption would betray itself through a whole cascade of escalating signals, and those signals would be seen, analyzed, and understood well before any eruption could occur. The monitoring is the region's great protection, the ever-watchful eye that transforms an unknowable danger into a manageable and understood one. It also helps to understand what the warning signs of a real eruption would actually look like, because knowing this is part of what makes the current calm justified. Before a large eruption, a caldera does not simply explode out of a quiet state. It builds toward the event through a prolonged period of intensifying unrest. And that buildup follows patterns that scientists have learned to recognize from volcanoes around the world. The earthquakes would grow more frequent and more powerful, migrating in ways that trace the movement of magma toward the surface. The ground would deform more rapidly and more dramatically, swelling as magma pushed upward. The gases escaping from the ground would change in their composition and volume as fresh magma approached. The heat would rise. These signs would unfold over a meaningful span of time, likely weeks or months or longer, not in an instant, and each of them would be captured by the monitoring network. The current unrest at Long Valley, the recent rising, shows none of the hallmarks of this kind of escalating march toward eruption. It fits, instead, the familiar pattern of the ordinary restlessness that the caldera has displayed for decades without erupting, which is exactly why the scientists remain calm even as the ground rises once more. It helps to keep the actual risk in perspective, because the probability of a large eruption at Long Valley in any given year or even any given century is very low. The caldera has been restless for a long time without erupting, and the most recent science suggests it may be settling rather than building. The far more likely future, by an overwhelming margin, is that Long Valley continues its pattern of periodic unrest, rising and shaking from time to time without ever producing a significant eruption for as long as anyone alive today and their descendants for many generations will be around to watch it. The rising of the ground is a normal event in the life of a restless caldera, and it should be understood as such, as a fascinating and closely monitored geological process rather than a countdown to disaster. The scientists are not alarmed by the latest uplift, and neither should the public be. The appropriate response is the one the scientists themselves model: careful attention, continued monitoring, and a calm, clear-eyed understanding of a hazard that is real but remote. There is also value in appreciating why a place like Long Valley captures the imagination so powerfully, and why the phrase supervolcano, which is sometimes attached to the great calderas, carries such a charge. The ancient eruption that formed the caldera truly was enormous, one of those exceedingly rare events that operate on a scale beyond ordinary volcanic activity, and the knowledge that such a thing happened here, and that the deep reservoir which fed it still lingers below, naturally stirs a sense of awe and unease. But it is important to remember that these colossal eruptions are extraordinarily rare, separated by enormous spans of time, and that the vast majority of a caldera's existence is spent quietly, in exactly the kind of low-level restlessness that Long Valley now displays. The dramatic image of a supervolcano poised to devastate a continent makes for a gripping story, but it bears little relation to the actual, measured reality of a caldera that has slept for hundreds of thousands of years and continues to sleep. The awe is warranted, the terror is not. Long Valley deserves respect as a powerful feature of the Earth, but respect and panic are very different things. And it is respect, informed by understanding, that the caldera calls for. What the story of Long Valley really illustrates is the delicate balance between vigilance and alarm, between taking a genuine hazard seriously and being consumed by fear of it. Living near a caldera, or near any volcano, means living with a low probability, high consequence risk, and the wise way to hold such a risk is neither to ignore it nor to be paralyzed by it, but to monitor it, to understand it, and to prepare reasonably for it while getting on with life. The scientists who watch Long Valley embody this balance. They take the caldera seriously enough to maintain one of the most sophisticated monitoring operations anywhere, and yet they do not sound false alarms or stoke panic when the ground rises, because they understand the difference between unrest and eruption, between a system that is stirring and a system that is about to blow. That balance, that combination of serious attention and calm perspective, is the model for how anyone should relate to a hazard like this one. So Long Valley has risen again, as it has risen before, and will very likely rise again in the future, and the question of preparedness is worth raising. Not because catastrophe looms, but because thinking honestly about how we plan for rare, enormous events is always worthwhile. The most recent science suggests the caldera may be winding down rather than winding up. Its restlessness, the sign of a slow cooling rather than a gathering eruption, and the monitoring that surrounds it is extensive enough that any real move toward an eruption would be detected with time to spare. The gap that exists is less in the science and more in the harder work of public planning for an event so rare that it strains the imagination, and that gap is a fair thing to notice and to think about. But the rising ground itself is not a warning of imminent doom. It is the normal breathing of a restless giant that has slept for hundreds of thousands of years and shows every sign. According to the best current understanding, of settling deeper into its sleep rather than waking from it. The land in that quiet valley will keep rising and falling, trembling now and then as the deep forces beneath it shift and settle, and the scientists will keep their patient watch. And the resort town and the scattered communities will go on living their lives against the backdrop of a beautiful landscape that hides an ancient and formidable power far below. That is what it means to live above a caldera, to share the ground with a sleeping volcano, and to trust in the vigilance of those who watch it. Long Valley rising again is a reminder of that power and of that vigilance, an occasion to appreciate both the remarkable science that keeps watch over the caldera and the honest, humbling difficulty of planning for the rarest and largest of nature's events. The ground has risen, the scientists are watching, and the most likely truth, reassuring in its way, is that the great caldera is simply doing what restless calderas do, stirring in its long sleep without any intention, as far as anyone can tell, of truly waking. The wise response is not fear, but understanding, not panic, but preparedness, and above all the steady, watchful attention that has always been humanity's best answer to the vast and patient forces of the earth. In that watchful attention lies both our respect for the sleeping giant beneath the valley and our quiet confidence